Hello, everyone, and welcome. We'll start in just a minute or two as the room fills up here. Thanks for joining us today. So, welcome everyone to today's program on demographics, data, and diversity, understanding your community. My name is Kelly Hummerkauser here at Main Street America, the National Main Street Center. And I want to quickly give you a little bit of background on our program. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone, as it's the first question that I'm sure will come up, today's program is being recorded, and this will be available afterwards via Main Street America member webinar page. And we will also be happy to receive your questions during the program. You can use the Q&A function on your control panel to go ahead and type us a question in, or you may use the chat function to chat with us at any time during the program. I'll try to be monitoring those during the presentation, but keep in mind as well that we're always happy to answer questions and follow up too. So today we have three excellent presenters. I'll introduce everyone as they come on today, but we have Christina Gómez here. She's a professor of liberal arts at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Mike Powe, who's director of research at the National Main Street Center. And last but certainly not least is Norma Ramirez de Miess, our senior program officer and director of leadership development. So that's the order of our speakers as well. Before we kick off today's program though, I just want to remind everyone why we're here and what we're talking about. So Main Street America has a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement that we worked on over the past couple of years, and I'm sharing it here on the screen to remind everybody that we believe Main Streets are for everyone. At the core of our approach to revitalization is a commitment to creating places of shared prosperity, equal access to opportunity, and inclusive engagement. The National Main Street Center models and champions this vision through our actions and programs. I just want to remind you as well that there's a website, mainstreet.org/mainstreetsareforeveryone, where there are some compiled resources and ways to get started on this type of work. And we know that so many of your programs have, whether you're kind of taking some first steps with doing equitable entrepreneurship or creating programs in your community to engage everyone. But for some of us that are just getting started, before we build out new programs, we need to just remind ourselves at the very core, who is everyone that we're trying to engage in? How are we counting everyone? How are identities constructed? So today, to help us with that understanding, I'm really pleased to welcome Christina Gómez. Professor Gómez is chair of the Liberal Arts Department at the School of the Arts Institute of Chicago. She received her Ph.D. from Harvard and her MBA from the University of Chicago. She's written extensively on identity formation and demographic categorization, and she's a fantastic resource on how we view numbers and people in communities in America and across the globe, really. So welcome, Professor Gómez, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm super happy to be here with Main Street today. So let's get going. I have about 30 minutes, and I want just to remind everybody, this is an introduction, right? We can certainly talk much more about any of these topics. I'd be happy to talk more about them, but this is just a beginning of opening a discussion about what's happening currently in America. So let's start with demographics, just as a precursor, right? Demographics gives us a statistical understanding of what's happening across, in this case, the United States. Variables like age, race, ethnicity, gender, marital status are often what we see when we talk about demographics. And so today specifically, because we are talking about diversity, we're gonna focus on issues of race and ethnicity in the United States. Next. So let's just begin with the United States and its population and how we do these counts. We see these counts so often in the news, in newspapers, and how we talk about the United States. But I always start, especially with my classes, just about population. And here, the unit of analysis is the United States. So if you had to guess what the current population of the United States or who resides in the United States, what would your guess be? And Kelly has a little pop-up for us, yeah. So just check one. What is the estimated population of the United States? And those are individuals who are currently residing. I'm not asking citizenship, I'm asking people who are residing in the US. Okay, Kelly's gonna tally those up for us. And our next slide. Whoa, okay. So great, 61% of you were spot on. It is about 330 million. Another 5% said 78 million, much smaller. 18% said it was twice almost as big, and about 16% gave us 2.3 billion, which is really big and not the US. So thank you so much. Let's move on to the next slide. That gives you a sense. One of the ways that you can find out, and let me just say, as a total geek of numbers, this is a great website. It's the census.gov. It gives you the actual count, both in the United States and the world population. If you go there, census.gov, you'll find out that today it's approximately 330 million. 450,000 and 777 people. It's probably now closer to 785 probably. And then the world population. So just a cool place to go for counting, but that gives you a sense of what the landscape is. And then we can talk specifically about our communities, about your Main Street and the communities that you're in. Next slide. Okay, the census. Many of us know what the census is, right? It started in 1790. It's a count of the individuals in the United States. Very early on, it was instituted by the Constitution because it's important to know what the population is in understanding what our representation for our government will be. And overall, it's always included basic information, sex, age, race in different forms. But you should know that the census has changed radically over time. From 1790 to 2020, the census has become a tremendous, right, institution, and then the census questionnaire, an instrument to really gauge these issues that the US is interested in. Next slide. So the questionnaire is really what we're talking about here. And the questionnaire for me is fascinating, right? Because the questionnaire gives us a sense of what kinds of questions matter for this time. The history of the census and the census questionnaire gives us a sense of what's been happening in the United States. So you should know that the census questionnaire and the census is a very political, right, instrument in terms of understanding what's happening. It's also very social, right? Because it also, the changes that we see in the United States are often reflected in the census questionnaire, often though 10 and 20 years later. So it's super interesting to look at the variety of questionnaires that have existed. And I think many of you would be very surprised at the kinds of questions it has included over time. Next question. Okay, so this is the first page of the 2020 census. This is super interesting. And remember, the 2020 census went out over from during COVID. And so this became a huge problem. And how are we gonna get a good count? Tuesday, the Supreme Court Justice has now allowed the census, or the Office of Management and Budget, to shut down the census as of October 31st. So we're gonna get our count for 2020. There's been big debates about whether it's going to really account for everybody. That's still up in the air. But it's interesting to see and to look specifically at what the census is asking. So this is the first page. And first of all, what's important is that the unit of analysis, or what they're asking about, is who lives in your household. Notice that it's the household that you live. It could be your family members, but it doesn't have to be. It could be your roommate, maybe a relative, maybe not. It could be your partner, it could be a spouse. It varies tremendously. And the unit of analysis could be a house, an apartment, or mobile homes. Institutional spaces, right, are usually counted separately. And so that's really interesting to look at. And although the census asks a lot of questions about the basic stats, sex, race, marriage, etc., there's also something called the long form that only 5% of residents in the United States get. That form is much more detailed and gives us a lot of information. But a 5% survey of Americans gives us very good data to work for many, many other questions. And as a social scientist, I use the census quite a bit to get basic information, but also to get very detailed information. Again, a reminder that census is confidential. So although you fill it out with your name and information, those variables are not considered, and usually you should not be able to pin you to what your answers are. Next slide. Okay, so this is where it starts getting really interesting. This is the next set of questions, and let's look specifically at question 8. Question 8 is known as the Hispanic, Latino, Spanish origin question. It is a question that first started in 1980 as a national question. So we didn't really start classifying people under that category fully until 1980. In 1970, there was a subsampling, specifically in the Southwest and a little bit on the East Coast, and it was pretty biased on how they were doing it. It's interesting, because the census is such a large instrument, it really starts being thought of and printed actually almost 3, 4, 5 years before the census comes up on any given decennial year. So by the time this was during Nixon, by the time there was a very strong movement to get this question in the census, it was already too late. So they only did a subsampling in 1970. In 1980, it is a full question. But this brings us to the question that many people ask me. What is the difference between race and ethnicity? In our Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, Spanish origin people, and we'll talk about that terminology in a bit, are they a race group? Well, in the United States, generally and sociologically, we think of race as referring to physical differences in groups and cultures and groups that we consider socially significant. Ethnicity refers to culture, such as language, ancestry, practices, and beliefs. It gets tricky because there is overlap. It also is tricky because both categories are what's called socially constructed. And what we mean by that is that we have made it up, right? Now, it doesn't mean just because we made it up, it doesn't matter, right? Using the words of Cornel West, race does matter, and I would add, so does ethnicity. It matters tremendously, especially in the United States, but also globally. But what we mean by that is that these categories have changed over time, right? They've changed over time for many reasons: political reasons, lobbying reasons, new understanding of groups, new groups being found, etc. Right? So if you think historically at the history of race, which really begins in our modern sense, probably in the 16th century, the categories of race have changed over time, right? I can go into a long lecture about that, but it's super interesting. You should also know that in the census change. So in the US, although we generally think of 5 main categories, which I'll talk about in a moment, the Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, Spanish origin question also came into being in 1980. In this talk, I'm often going to use Hispanic. That's a terminology that's used by the US government. In the 1990s, the category Latino came really into use, Latino, Latina. It's very gendered. It's also a sense and kind of a nod to the people who are born in Latin America as opposed to Hispanic, which really nods to Spanish-speaking people. So for Latin America, for example, that would not include Brazil or Suriname or Guyana. But now, many younger people, in fact, are using the term Latinx because it's a gender neutral term. And my guess is by 2030, maybe 2040, that term might in fact enter the census as well as many other terms. But let's go back to number 8, which I think is super interesting. So the question in 2020 asks, is this person of Hispanic, comma, Latino, comma, Spanish origin? You can say, no, I'm not. And then you go to question 9, which is the race question. Or you go and you say, yes, I am Mexican-American, Mexican, Chicano. Chicano is a fascinating term for me because that's almost a political term. Again, another long lecture about that. But that got into the census and has stayed since 1980 is super interesting. And again, speaks to the politics of the census itself. You can also say, of course, that you're a Puerto Rican or Cuban. And you can also list other Latino groups. Again, the first 3 really because they are considered the largest 3 Latinx groups in the United States, but of course there are many other groups as well: Peruvian, Chilean, Argentinian, etc. Right? So as any individual fills out the census, question 8, no, I'm not, you move to question 9. Yes, I am, you fill it out and you go to question 9. This should make you think is that every person who says yes to the Hispanic question also has a race category. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is question 9. what is this person's race? Interestingly, in 2010, the race question and the Hispanic question got reversed. And I'll tell you in a second why that is. So this is the race question. Generally in the United States, since 1980, since maybe 1970, we've been basically using 5 major race categories, more or less, okay? It's white, Black or African American, American Indian / Alaskan Native, the Asian, what's called the Asian Pacific Islander, which is the list of groups of Asian Pacific Islander groups, and then number 5, some other race. Super interesting, like what is that category? So anyway, let's step back. What's interesting again to see is that if you look at the census, these are from the census directions of 2020. If you look at the category white, it says print, for example, German, Irish, English, Italian, Lebanese, Egyptian. Again, not everyone who's Egyptian may consider themselves white. Many white people may not consider Egyptians white. But often Northern Africa has been looped into the white category. And again, that could be debated, but this is how the census defines it. Black or African American, again, gives you a list of individuals who identify as Black, including people from the Caribbean, but also people from various African countries. In that also may include people from Latin American countries, Panama, Puerto Rico, right? It's really interesting. American Indian or Alaska Native, print the enrolled or printable tribes, for example, so Navajo, right? Nation, Blackfeet, etc. Notice that they also include Mayan and Aztec. Again, as a person who works on this, it's interesting. In Latin America, tribal affiliation, the way it's thought about in the United States, is not exactly the same. So to say that I have a Mayan tribal affiliation doesn't really transfer to the US sense, but there it is. And then the list of Asian Pacific Islander and then some other race. A few things to note. It wasn't, notice that it says mark more than one, mark 1 or more boxes and print the origins. It wasn't until 2000 that that was even allowed. Prior to the 2000 census, you could mark only 1. You could only say whether you're white or whether you identify as Black or whether you identify as American Indian, etc. So that was an entirely new option. And that was because it was lobbied so hard. There's been wonderful books and articles written about this. And much of that happened because of the increase of mixed race individuals or people who identify as multiracial in the United States. Again, let me just remind you, race is socially constructed. So what does that mean to be mixed race? Great question, right? But there it is. And we also have to think historically, right? It wasn't until 1967, Loving versus Virginia, that federally we were able to marry and to partner with individuals of a different race given these categories. So you can imagine by 2000, there were more and more what we would call mixed race children. And especially many parents lobbied the census very hard for the ability for individuals, and in particular their children, to mark more than one category. In 2000 though, I think less than 3% of individuals marked more than one. Remember at this point, Tiger Woods was in our good graces, right? Felt he was Cablinasian, he was Caucasian, Asian, Native American, and Chinese. He was someone who would have marked, I think actually 5 categories on the census in 2000 and 2010. So again, it's really interesting to see how these categories are, again, are social, are political, are reacting to what's happening to the United States. At the same time, I want to say that also the census helps us also understand these categories. So for those of us who for the first time really thought like I didn't know that you can be more than one race, the census also prompts changes in our society. So it really is very relational what the census does, and the power of the census, I think, is super interesting. One more note, this category, some other race. Some of you may be asking, what is that? Well, it's interesting. In 2010, 37% of the individuals who marked yes, they were Hispanic in question 8 in some form. 37% of those individuals were also saying they were some other race and writing it in. So they were saying, yes, I'm Mexican on question 8, and on question 9, they were writing some other race and writing Mexican again. Again, for many sociologists, they would say, well, that's an ethnicity, and Mexico itself, right, that would be a national origin. But for individuals in the US, where they are coming from countries where race perhaps means something else, this concept of race and having to choose one can be very confusing, or they feel very strongly that they do view being Latinx, Hispanic, Latino, Latina as a race category themselves. What is also interesting is that approximately half of all individuals who identify as Hispanic, those who we just said marked yes on question 8, approximately half of them identify as white, which is again something that's often lost when we are looking at this in newspapers or people are talking about it in the media. Because in fact the census identifies Hispanic as an ethnicity, they all also have a race category. However, when these numbers are often reported, when we see these demographics, you see the categories as though we're comparing apples to apples, right? White, Black, Hispanic, Asian, Native American. We see it in that way. But in fact, what's missing is that Hispanics can also be Black, also be white, also be Native American, or also be Asian, but they're usually pulled out of these categories. But this is why it gets confusing that on surveys, sometimes you see the term non-Hispanic white, and that's really what they're referring to. Next slide. Okay, so again, the United States. So we just learned there are about 330 million people in the United States, right? Great, 8% of you got that, yay. My question now to you is, what is the breakdown of the US? What do you think the US, right, consists of? What percentage of the population do you think is white? Is it 40%? Is it 20? Is it 90, right? What percentage do you think of Americans or people currently residing in the United States identify as being Black or African American? Do you think it's 5%? Do you think it's 20? Do you think it's 40, right? And what's interesting is often this is correlated to where you might be living and the diversity that you have in your area. So right now, these are the categories that generally most of us in the social sciences are thinking about, right? White/Caucasian, European American, Black, African American, Latinx, Hispanic, Asian Pacific Islander, Native American, or mixed. And that mix now we're able to count because of what happened in the 2000 census. So the next slide will give us the results. Okay, so in the US right now, 60%, these are 2019 numbers, I believe, 60% of Americans identify as white. And what I mean alone is not that they're alone and lonely, but rather that they identify with only one category, right? Only as white racially. And this is true for all of them as well. 13.4% identify as Black or African American, 18.5% as Latinx or Hispanic, 6.1 as Asian Pacific Islander, 1.3 as Native American, and 2.8 as mixed. So one of the things that should pop out, the story that these numbers are telling you is that the Latinx Hispanic category has grown substantially. It is now considered, right, and this is where it gets tricky, the largest minority group, although it's not really a minority group and it's not a race group in compared to African Americans or Blacks. So this is where it gets hard. But around 2002 is when that group really got larger. So when we're talking about diversity, that is the largest group in terms of what we think of people who are non-white with an asterisk, right? The Asian Pacific Islander category has also grown. Although it's just 6.1, the growth is substantial and we're gonna see it continually growing. And finally, the mixed group, people who are identifying as more than one race, that is also growing quickly. And let me show you what that looks like in the next slide. Here's a slide, it's super interesting. So this is 2012, 2060, so it shows a growth of almost 50 years. Notice that the first category, again, white alone, and these are all individuals who identified as white with no other race group. In 2012, that group was 78%. By 2060, it's 69. But wait, if you jump to the next bar graph, way over where it says non-Hispanic white, thank you, Kelly, you see that it's 63%. So these are individuals who in 2012 identified as white and not Hispanic, right? They pulled those people out. So notice that that change was 15% right there. And in 2060, that group now will be 43, right? So it goes below what we would think of as the majority and now at 43%. Notice the big change is with the Hispanic group. And again, on the bottom, it says of any race. And that is because Hispanic, Latinx individuals also have a race category that they identify with. And that group has almost grown, almost threefold, 2.5, from 17% in 2012, right? Right now it's at about 18, 19%. And in 2060, easily gonna be 31. And then you see the other groups as well. Notice that Black and African American, very small growth in those 50 years. Same for American Indian and the same for Asian or Pacific Islander. The 2 or more races is growing a bit, but it's still at 6.4%. Let me just make one more comment about this. This assumes that the definitions of these groups stay the same, okay? And historically, this is very... What I'm talking about is that also the categories of these race groups have changed over time. If you look at the history, for example, of the Irish, remember when the Irish first came to the United States, they were not considered white by any means, especially by the British, right? That really changes in the early 1900s, where groups like the Irish, Italians, other Southern Europeans were basically allowed to enter the white category, right? And so now when we think of who is white, it includes those ethnic groups. One of the questions that has been put out there is, what's gonna happen to the Latinx group? Are they gonna merge into their own standalone category, or are they gonna merge into what we think of as the white category? For the mixed race group, what's gonna happen to them? So those are super interesting questions that we're dealing with that would change these numbers radically, and also how we understand what it means to be American. Because these demographics really, for me, and I think for many people, and I think for the concerns that you have on Main Street, really is about belonging, about community, about serving your communities, and to some extent, who is part of this group. And race, for lots of reasons, and sadly today, right, we've had lots of difficulty, right, in thinking about these issues. How do we understand the nation of the United States as one nation with these different categories, but also moving forward in a very particular, positive, progressive way? Next slide. Okay, so let me just give you a quick, I have 4 minutes left, a quick overview of what this looks like. I also wanted to show you a different visual, right? So the growth of communities is super interesting across the United States. So I did this quick overview. If you look at the Latino Hispanic group, remember I told you it wasn't until 1980 that we really started counting them nationally. So this gives you a map with the coloring in purple, right, of where the Latino groups are seen geographically. Again, no surprise, a strong presence in the Southwest. Why? Because in 1848, that was Mexico. Let's not forget that, right? So that was Mexico. So no surprise, we have a strong group, mostly of Mexicans there, but also other growth, right? You get the Florida area, right? This is 1980, already a movement from Cuba to what we know as the Miami-Dade area. We get New York City, where you have many Puerto Ricans, right? Operation Bootstrap, et cetera. Then you have the sprinkling in Chicago, a little bit in the Midwest, but that is really it. We jump to 1990 or 2000, I think is the next one. 2000, whoa, big explosion, right? You see the Southwest really growing almost into the Midwest. You see the Chicago area, look how much that's grown. So it's not just Chicago, but it moves all the way out to the Western communities, Elgin, St. Charles, right? But you see it also moving into Iowa. Look at Minnesota, that's super interesting, right? And then of course, Florida, it's not just the Miami-Dade area, but it goes all the way north into the Pensacola, kind of Panama City area, up the East Coast, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, much of this having to do with agricultural work and poultry work. And then New York, New Jersey spreads considerably into even upstate New York, right? So you see the big change that's happened there. Let me also just mention Alaska, Hawaii also has a strong presence. Let's go to 2011 is my next one, finally, right? This gives you a sense of the growth of the population. So this is what 18%, and it would be darker today, right, of a population means, right? And the sprinkling that we see of the Latinx community, not just in the historic areas, the Southwest, Florida, New York, but across the United States into places like Arkansas, Nebraska, Missouri, right? So that gives you a good visual of these changes that we're seeing. Let me show you the next slide. Aha. This is the projection that demographers have for the majority minority changes that are happening. So you should notice 2020, the year that we're in now, 50.2% of children are quote unquote minorities, meaning people who are identifying as Black, Latinx, Asian, Native American, or mixed. So we are there with children. 2044, more or less, is the year that we expect for the United States to become majority minority, where 50.3% of all Americans will be considered one of those groups, right? And that's gonna continue. Again, right, I wanna just preface, the definitions can change and that would change things. But it does mean those maps that I just showed you are gonna continue to change, and the populations that you're serving are going to continue to change as well. Next slide. What's interesting is that we've all been thinking about this, of course, and so there's been many surveys that have gone out. The Pew Research Center, if you go onto their website, has some great surveys that they've done. So when they asked Americans if they are satisfied with the racial mix in their communities where they live, right, 24% that said that a community was more racially mixed, but 66% said they were very satisfied with the racial mix. However, this is an interesting question. Most Americans, in fact, have very little interaction with people who are different than them. So they're also saying this, but not a lot of people have interaction with other groups. And you can look at this data more specifically on their research center. Next slide. This tells us also, this was an interesting question. Percentage saying that the fact that the US population is made up of people from many different races and ethnicity has a positive impact on Americans' culture. For all the people they surveyed in the United States, right, 64% said, yeah, it's a positive thing. However, it breaks down by race, right? Hispanics more than other groups are happier or feel more positive about it. And when you break it up by political groups, there's a little bit of a change there. 50% for Republicans, 77% for Democrats. Again, these are perceptions of how we feel about the diversity in our community. Next slide. Finally, in conclusion, I do think it's super interesting that we kind of step back a bit. The US is a really interesting place in terms of it is a country of the world, right? It's a country made up of many different people from the very beginning and continues to be as well. And no other country really in the United States, right, has the type of diversity and will continue to have the type of diversity that we're having. And I think that's really exciting. And I think for those of us working in our areas, whether it's education, in business, in the law, et cetera, it is important to really to understand that. And I think knowing and having this information really helps us make decisions about what's going to be happening in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Thank you, Kelly.
Well, thank you so much, Christina. So much more to know about the census and how it defines what we're looking at across the country than we could ever think, really. And that leads us at Main Street America to think about ways that our communities connect with that type of information and how to make that information something that helps you do the work that you do day to day in communities. So I want to bring on now Mike Powe, who's Main Street America's Director of Research, to talk to us a little bit about a new tool that he's developing to help us in our communities better understand the folks that are there and how it compares to the rest of the country. So Mike, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let you take that away.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Kelly. And thank you, Professor Gómez, Christina, for very interesting, and in some ways I'm looking back and forth at the data I'm going to show to see how it matches up, or in which cases it's further confusing or contradictory. So I wanted to give you a sneak preview of something that we're going to be rolling out here very shortly, probably in the next week or two, a new demographic tool, or map to look at Main Street communities and see how communities compare to their metropolitan areas, to their surrounding states, what the demographic profile of any given Main Street community looks like. So again, this is not launched yet. This is just a sneak preview. I hope you're seeing the screen, seeing the map. So what you'll see is a map first of the accredited and affiliate programs, with the accredited programs in blue and the affiliate program. I'm just going to very quickly show you a few places and you can see how the data looks. I will say, making things more complicated. So the census we all know the decennial census, which is happening now, which is just wrapping up. I think today is the last day for 2020 participation. There's also an American Community Survey that's sampled. I've received it in the mail before and filled it out, that has much more detailed questions about housing units, about more information about your education and income. The information that I'm utilizing on this map is all from the American Community Survey. And it's also complicated in that we're using 5-year estimate data. So it's the aggregation of 5 years worth of data. I'm using data from 2008 through 2012, or no, excuse me, 2006 to 2010 and 2014 through 2018. So I'm using 2 5-year ranges. You may not need to know any of that, but I feel like I should explain that. So when you see the data And especially when you look at the data that Professor Gómez just shared, some of the numbers don't quite match up. And I'll explain some of the other ways they don't match up. So to go to the map here, you can click on, I chose Alton, Illinois, which is an interesting place just outside of St. Louis in sort of southern central Illinois. I will actually make my screen a little bit bigger here so you can see. So you click on any given community with the Main Street program and you get this profile. So Alton's an accredited program. It's part of the St. Louis metropolitan area. There's been a loss of about 5% of their population between those two 5-year collections of data. You can scroll down through this and see information about race and ethnicity. So quick kind of snapshot of the 2014 through 2018 data, where 71% of the population was white, 24% was Black or African American, et cetera, et cetera. I've built this information out. So thinking back on Professor Gómez's presentation, I built this information so it's just using race by itself, regardless of Hispanic or Latino status. And I've used Hispanic or Latino status separately. So I'm showing these two things completely separately. So white may include folks from Latin America, for instance, or folks from the Middle East, for instance. Just to clarify that and confuse that at the same time. For each of these data points, I'm showing the greatest share of the population in 2018 as a snapshot, the greatest increased share of the population, so the proportion that changed, that increased most, and the proportion that decreased most between those two sets of data collections. So the population in Alton who identified as white increased 1.5%, while the population who identified as Black or African American as a share decreased by almost 2%. And for each of these data points, I'm showing Alton relative to St. Louis metropolitan area, which is the broader geography, relative to the state of Illinois, relative to the United States. And I have similar information presented for the age of residents with a breakout. I think I have 5 different age groups with educational attainment and with income. And I've also provided, in case you're really interested in digging into this, the complete data tables for those categories, those groups of data and those geographies. So again, all the information on race from those two points in time for Alton, Illinois, compared to the metropolitan area, compared to the state, compared to the country. And you know, this is built out for the entire country, for every Main Street program. On the back end, there's a lot more data that we'll be able to use to talk about, you know, what Main Street programs look like if that was a country by itself, or how coordinating programs look when you look at their collection of programs relative to the metropolitan area or state that they're in. I won't dig into DC. I was going to show you 2 communities, but in the interest of time, I'll just show you that quick snapshot. Happy to answer questions, happy to talk more about and hear more from you about ways you might leverage this data. I think just to throw a few things out there, you can think about the kind of volunteers you usually get from programs, the composition of Main Street Programs board, the kinds of people who attend your programs. To what extent are those publics or those individuals representative of your community and of the directional change of demographics in your community? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and stop talking, but look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Mike, for previewing that tool. And I just want to let everyone know as well at this juncture that there will be a survey following the presentation today that will immediately pop up. And one of the 4 quick survey questions that we have for everyone following this program is what kind of information or how might this tool be most useful to you? So as Mike's building it out before he releases it publicly, since you're in this program, we wanted to give you the opportunity to provide feedback as this is being developed. So please look out for that. But now to talk to us a little bit more about the things that Mike was just concluding on about how this is most useful to your Main Street communities, I want to bring us back to the PowerPoint and introduce Norma Ramirez de Miess, our wonderful Senior Director of Leadership Development and Senior Program Officer. Norma, take it away.
Thank you, Kelly, and I'm so glad to be the last one because the information is so good and leads to what I want to share quickly with you. And let me just say that there will be more virtual sessions, more webinars, more workshops that we're going to put together so that we can indeed increase our understanding about how can we utilize data, demographics, understand them in our community, what our community is, and then apply it to the work that we are doing in revitalization in Main Street. That is the question. What does it mean for our Main Street to have all this information? In the past, we've been busy just taking a look and saying, what projects can we implement? And the few of us that are involved are the ones that decide on those projects for the most part. What we are hoping and we're proposing now is, number one, to understand who do we have in our community? What's the makeup? What are the demographics? And in this case, we've been giving a lot of information with regards to the makeup, with regards to race, ethnicity, but we do have diversity in many forms, including the age and including, you know, again, different perspectives within communities and within cultures. So much more to come so that you feel that there's going to be a series of opportunities as well. But one thing that it's important is to understand what it means for our Main Street programs, for our communities as well, those that have a Main Street. The fact that we start with a full circle, coming back with what Kelly shared with us at the beginning, the statement that we want to be the statement everybody can say, can speak loudly and say, we believe that Main Streets are for everyone. And with that comes this beautiful sentence that gives us a sense of what we want to accomplish. At the core of that approach that we all are using is that commitment to creating the type of places that we all can share in prosperity, in opportunity, and in participation. In everything that we do is for everybody to share, for everybody to benefit, and to participate as well. And that's why the 4-point approach is so important, because it gives us the opportunities to say that diversity can actually have a very good application with Main Street, with our 4-point approach, because we have diversity and reasons to involve everybody in our community, from whether it's economic reasons, looking at business retention, business development, real estate development, but important enough to understand that the community's quality of life and economic vitality will depend on how we successfully and effectively invite everybody to be a part of it. And then understand that not only do we have a history that we are all trying to preserve and to celebrate, but also some cultural assets that we need to welcome and let those assets enrich the fabric of our community. In many ways, that's organically being done. And so what we need is to really take a look at the strategy around it and say, how can we embrace it and let it be a power to build a destination for our district and for our community. And that to connect us all so that we can be the type of community that we can be proud of, working, enjoying, and being part of. This is what Main Street is all about. And again, we're going to be talking more and more about how can we make this effort of becoming the inclusive force for everybody in the community to participate in revitalization. So next, I wanted to focus specifically in 2 areas. We talk often about engagement. I want us to know that I have 2 very important pieces here for engagement. First is engaging ourselves. It starts with us. Sometimes we think that we need to figure out how to get everybody to become part of our efforts. But it really should start with us understanding how everybody and what our community is, what do we have as the makeup of our community, so that we can then formulate some strategies on how to invite and welcome and engage everybody in the revitalization effort. In many ways, you probably heard me say in many of our sessions how we can start with looking at the census. And I'm so glad that Professor Gómez, Christina, you gave us such a great piece of information and a lot of background to understand it. And then Mike gave us a preview of what tool we're going to have within our own Main Street America's resources that you will be able to use as well. So wherever you are, let's start with that. Let's take a look at your demographics in your community and feel your understanding of who you have with regards to race or ethnicity, but also age, gender, and an understanding of the economic diversity as well. Again, that's the starting point. Engaging ourselves in building that understanding so that we know then how to compare who we have at this time and who we don't have. And that's the opportunity we have to take a look and say, well, is our board representative? Well, if we don't know what our community's makeup is, how can we analyze that, right? And so market analysis has always been a very important part of our Main Street efforts. But in many ways, we led market analysis to just tell us the economic picture of the conditions and the opportunities. What we want is that analysis of data to give us more information, to be able to use the Main Street approach and leverage that information. So again, engaging ourselves in building some understanding, and you can do this with your boards, with your committee leadership. Enjoy coming together to really build that understanding and then have that conversation of what this means for you. How does this apply? Next, then, is the opportunity to take a look at how do we use the Main Street approach to recognize how to engage ourselves in understanding the common grounds and the distinctive assets of our community and its diversity. The reality is that with diversity, there are things that we're going to discover everybody has in common, or for the most part, there are common themes that we all share. Entrepreneurship upbringing, the love for art and culture, entertainment. Well, there are some common efforts there. And I wanted to start taking a look at, since we are in Main Street, looking at our districts, the economic base that we have and their demographics. Compare them to your community's demographics and understand what is the mix of businesses that you have. But this is beyond, okay, is it a retail or is it a restaurant? It is more about the background, because the background brings a very good level of understanding of why do they do business the way they do. And it's important for us in Main Street because there cannot be more local business development than in Main Street. And many of our entrepreneurs are looking to come to our districts, or to already those that are part of the districts. They want to be part of your efforts. They just perhaps don't know how or what you're doing that can have in common with their interest and their vision as well. So let's take a look at the opportunities to understand our district's business makeup as well. That is the base of entrepreneurs, that for the most part, those diverse cultures, immigrants, and minorities are very well known for that entrepreneurial upbringing. And when we get to know that, then we will be able to then see what do they want for our district? How do they see the physical elements of our district? And being able to then say, if you don't mind, Kelly, let's go through the next set of pictures. And when you think of your district, then you can say, why is it that our business owners and our property owners from other cultural backgrounds, from other races, from other ethnicities, or from different generations do their business the way they do it, and how they perceive our district, and how do they want to be able to do business? What is the way they do real estate? What is the interest that they have in improving the appearance of their building, their business, or the streets? I can attest, as in my past as a Main Street director, I know that everybody in your district has an interest in participating with something that improves their surroundings, their business, and their life. They sometimes don't know how. So we need to understand connectors. When we understand what their interest is, we will be able to find a fit in Main Street as well. And let's take a look at then how many of these different backgrounds and diverse cultural perspectives and roots can enrich the already special and unique destination that we means. And so from or Hispanic or Latino, like to bring those assets to enrich the destination of our districts. And that's the opportunity that we have to create and celebrate community with all these sectors of our community that are already present there. So continue to consider the opportunity to get to know what your community and your district are about. And then let's then figure out how can we use the Main Street approach and our understanding of our community and our district to really then take a look at how can we engage them in the revitalization effort. So here's an opportunity to consider, and we're going to be talking more in the next few webinars. So when we think of Main Street, what do people know about Main Street, and how is the language and the message that we share resonating with them? And that's very important that we consider. It might be resonating for us, but is it for everybody? So when we look at this slide, what I wanted to share is the opportunity to think of a message that resonates with everybody, that your district, and I love these pictures from, one is from Quincy, Illinois, and the other one is from Boston. When everybody knows that your district is their district as well, that this is everybody's district. When this is my downtown, I'm going to want to be part of it. Everything that you are doing is probably going to be of interest to me as well. But furthermore, when it's important for people to know that they are important to you, that their engagement is crucial for your success, so that it makes it everybody's success, then it will be a greater opportunity to open the doors for engagement. Let's then take a look at the opportunities we have to then consider volunteering. Is our volunteering just a form that says, if you want to volunteer at this time, fill out this form? That is kind of being testy, right? That's like saying, if you want to know what my business is, just do the research, figure it out, and then tell me what you want to buy. We don't do business like that, right? We promote what we have to offer. Therefore, the opportunities for volunteering have to be clearly defined, motivational, and in many ways, putting pictures with others telling us why they enjoy volunteering for Main Street will make sense for many of our business owners, for many of our residents that are from other cultures. And speaking the language that they speak is always a plus. It's not that sometimes it's needed, it's that sometimes it's a preference. And that is an advantage when we are able to speak and provide the message that resonates to those communities that we want to invite to be part of these efforts. And I love these examples that we have from the APPROACI Collaborative in Miami, a new, relatively new organization, but definitely new in Main Street, that is developing their Main Street effort with what they say, Main Street con sabor, with taste, with flavor. And again, that's the opportunity to understand that when we speak the Main Street language, sometimes we need to translate it into something more motivational than just a list of projects or just the language we know internally. And that perhaps speaking in the language where our community perhaps have a higher percentage of population, like in some of our communities, 40%, in some of our communities, 20%, it's an advantage. It's an opportunity to say that you want them to be part of. And I appreciate seeing those efforts, for example, in downtown Pasco in Washington. The translation of the website information is the leadership and staff to the Spanish language because their population has a strong percentage of Hispanics. Is very important. And the opportunity to see that in more and more of your communication tools will be crucial for success, just like in Kendall Whittier, and the opportunity to translate the Main Street's efforts in Spanish as well. So again, let's take a look at those opportunities ahead. We're going to be able to speak more in future webinars, but we just wanted to get you started, that this is indeed a commitment to building a more inclusive effort in our revitalization programs. And with that comes, next, Kelly, the opportunity to say that in Main Street, we have a case that we need to build, that it is natural, it is very much, in my opinion, Main Street and diversity go hand by hand if we want to make everybody a part of this effort, because it is in everything that we do. We say that we're community driven. That's the opportunity we have to really invite the community. Next is then the opportunity to say that Main Streets have a position to serve, a role that they can play as catalytic forces for active and inclusive engagement from everybody in the community. I can see that if we use the Main Street approach, everybody will find a reason to be part of these efforts. And finally, is the opportunity to take a look and say that downtown as an organization, downtowns must work to make sure that downtowns belong to everybody, that everybody can enjoy them, but also that all those voices need to be included. If you want to take this case and make it your own, we invite you to adopt this statement and more importantly, to make the commitment to understand your community and your demographics, to understand your district's demographics as well, and then to leverage all those demographics and those assets to find the common themes, the common grounds, and the distinctive differences that bring us some opportunities to build and enrich our own culture in our community. With that, then comes the invitation for us to be attentive to what's coming next in Main Street with regards to the opportunity to build an inclusive revitalization program at the local level and a movement across the country. So Kelly, if you want to take a look and mention, you're free to mention more about what's coming during the Trust Conference.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Norma, for all of that wisdom about how we could be looking at data, including that in our efforts across all of our communities. I did want to point everybody, we do anticipate developing content, as Norma has been saying, into a series of programs or webinars that we can continue to share and talk about these and many other topics, really take a deep dive into so many different areas that we need to be focusing on. And there will be an opportunity again on that survey that immediately pops up when this webinar closes to provide your feedback on what those next steps conversations should focus on. We have a list going, but we're excited to hear from you as well. But we also wanted to point you to the immediate next step would be in 2 weeks' time, joining us for the National Trust for Historic Preservation Pass Forward Conference. Vu Le, who's a nonprofit leader and blogger, he runs a blog called Nonprofit AF. I highly encourage you to check it out if you need some a kick in the pants about how to get going on creating equity in your Main Street communities. He will be speaking along with Main Street leaders from several communities on what it means to create equitable and resilient Main Streets, and we're really glad to have this program as part of Pass Forward. This is unfortunately one of the programs that you have to pay for in order to attend. We would encourage everyone to attend, of course, the Main Street GAMSA Plenary, which is a free event during the conference. But really the conference is overall very affordable and wonderful content throughout, and there'll be a huge focus on equitable development and historic preservation throughout the conference, but this session is specifically geared towards Main Street leaders. So I just highly encourage you to attend if you can, and look out for more announcements about the conference. But that said, we wanted to make sure that there was a little bit of time, and we have a couple of minutes for any questions and answers, so I'll invite our speakers to kind of come on camera again, should you want to, so that we can all answer any questions that we might have from the audience. I have one question that's in, and it's from one of our partners. So hi, William. He says, the nonprofit Cobalt Community Research provides demographic, psychographic, and economic data, not only at the community levels, not only at the community level, but at district, street, neighborhood census levels. How useful is this kind of information at the sub-municipal level rather than the muni-wide level? And I think, Mike, that's a good question for you. I think specifically maybe for some of our more urban Main Street districts or Main Street districts that exist within larger areas generally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it sort of points to a different level, a different way you could use the information. I think you could use the information if it's at the kind of market level to understand for individual businesses or for a vacant property how a property can be activated, what the sort of clientele is that's regularly visiting an area, that sort of a thing. Yeah.
Well, waiting for more questions to come in from our audience, I just wanted to thank our presenters. We really want to make sure that everyone has this as a, again, starting point for really taking off on different ways to view your community and make sure that when you're connecting your programs to data, you're doing so with all the different factors in mind. So Professor Gómez, any final words you want to add for us about, well, we have a question for you, so hold on for that. How would the demographic data change for the United States if there were a category of people who were Middle Eastern on the US Census? What an interesting question.
That's a great question. It would certainly pull, it would depend on whether that would be a race category or an ethnicity category, and then whether they're pulled from, I'm guessing, a variety of race. It would function very similar to what we're seeing now with the Hispanic Latinx category. I have a long background story that I can't get into about that, about really what happened, right, in the 2010 census and during the early 2000s with regard to those questions. But yes, right, I think, again, this is another excellent example of how race is socially constructed, right? We now, many of right? And because a group of people now of immigrants have come in, and now we understand it differently. And individuals themselves may want to be understood in a different way. So it's always relational.
Thank you. You might have paused for just a second there. You did for me, at least. I'm not sure about for others. So I missed a moment of what you were saying, but I understand what you're saying. It's always relational. And categories are socially constructed. And I think Professor Gómez has maybe stalled out there for another moment. We may have gotten just to this critical point in Christina's internet right here. So this is a wonderful point of the program. We did have one more question come in that would be for Professor Gómez. Where do Brazilians and other Portuguese speakers from Latin America fall in the US Census? And that's such an interesting question as well. And of course, she would tell you, I think if she could right now, that some of this is personal choice and how different folks identify. And it seems as though she's might be getting back with us.
I am back.
You paused for a moment. I just want to address the other question that came in before we close out today. Where do Brazilians and other Portuguese speakers from Latin America fall in the US Census? Oh dear. Okay, we might have lost Christina again. And given that, I think we are happy to answer some of those questions. If you have any more, Christina's contact information is on the screen. She loves to chat about this stuff. So I would say, please reach out to her, or you're also welcome to reach out to, of course, Mike, Norma, or if you reach out to Main Street broadly, we're happy to answer your questions at any time about this type of content. And we're hoping that this was just thought-provoking for you about how we think about race and ethnicity in communities. Norma, any final words to close us out?
No, just a big thanks, because those that participated are definitely showing commitment to understanding and applying. And so again, just an invitation to stay tuned, because we're going to offer more. And then also there are publications we've had in the past, articles. And then of course, recently throughout just as of today or yesterday, an article also from our new district in Allapattah, Miami. So take a look at the information and publications we've had, but we'll be providing more content in the next few months.
Well, I would thank everybody for your attention today. Again, a recording will be made available, and please stay tuned for the pop-up survey that you receive when you exit the program today. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and we'll see you in continuing programs.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.